In this video, we're going to provide a brief review of qualitative macroeconomic analysis. All right, we talked about this in class on last Wednesday, but I wanted to just touch on this because don't forget what we're trying to accomplish here. In Project 2, we're going to conduct qualitative analysis to discuss the current environment of the macroeconomy. In Project 2, you're going to write a one-page report, and in that report, you're going to discuss fiscal and monetary policy, how those policies might change in the upcoming year, and what your expectation for consumption and capital investment is, and how it's going to overall affect the overall economy. Okay, so that's the objective, to write a one-page report. In this video, we're going to talk about some qualitative macroeconomic analysis. Okay. Remember, we're working with this model here. Y equals C plus I plus G plus NX, where the left-hand side variable is GDP. On the right-hand side, we assume that part of GDP is made up from consumption. Remember, the comparative advantage in the United States is that we like to buy stuff. And it's been shown historically that about 67% of GDP is made up from consumption. The I is capital or business investment. No, please be able to delineate between what this means. This is firms investing in new machinery. It's firms investing in new capital projects. All right. This isn't me speculating in the stock market and investing in stocks or bonds, but this is firms investing in real capital projects. Historically, about 16% of GDP has been made up of capital or business investment. The G on the right-hand side of this equation is government spending. We talked a little bit about this last week. About 20% of GDP has been made up of government spending. Government spending, we'll talk about different changes in policy, in both fiscal policy and monetary policy. And we came to the consensus in class last Wednesday that the government is going to spend no matter what types of policies those are. Okay. And there is some positive effect, at least in this model, that government spending will increase GDP. You can think of, we talked about public goods in our last class. We talked about maybe national defense as a public good, right? So if a single individual wanted to protect the nation or provide national defense for the rest of the nation, there'd be a whole bunch of free riders. So instead of allowing that to happen, we pool our resources, and we basically invest in national defense. As a society, the government spends money on that, and the spending of government on national defense might boost GDP. You can think of the building of rockets or the building of technology for national defense, providing the building of infrastructure for a military that might increase GDP. Last but not least is net exports. Historically, the United States has been a net importer. We import more than we export. Net export makes up about 3% of GDP. This is the model that we're going to use. This is a very basic model. In subsequent videos, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of other factors that probably should be included in this model, but we aren't going to do that because we need some simplicity. All right. So let's keep this model in the back of our minds as we talk about different types of governmental policy. As you'll recall from our discussion last week, there's two types of policy that we'll talk about in this class. The first is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is executed by two branches of the government: the executive branch of government, you can think of that as the presidency of the United States, and the legislative branch of government, or Congress. Out of these branches of government come tax policy, what we're going to do with taxes, foreign policy, how we're going to engage other nations. I think that has an important implication in our model here. Trade policy, certainly right now, the Trump administration has administered several tariffs on Chinese goods and goods from other countries, and that has an effect, of course, through net exports. That has an effect on GDP, as well as regulation. While the Trump administration has provided tariffs on imports from certain countries, the Trump administration has also deregulated many other industries in the U.S. economy, and that has an effect in our macroeconomic model. So recall from our last week's discussion, if taxes were to suddenly decrease like they did a few years ago, then individuals in the economy would likely have more disposable income and therefore C would increase. Likewise, if corporate taxes were decreased, then maybe firms would have more capital to invest in machinery or something, and I would increase. Even though taxes decreased, I have no doubt that the government will continue to spend, and we're not going to talk about how an unexpected decrease in taxes would affect net exports, but it could and likely will. You can think of foreign policy. Right now, in the economy, as of today, we're in March of 2020. Russia and the OPEC countries are in a little bit of a tiff, which is affecting oil prices. Oil prices are extremely low right now. That has an effect on GDP. So again, we talked about this last week, so I don't want to beat the dead horse. But these fiscal policy measures, we need to understand what these fiscal policy measures are. And as fiscal policy changes, that's going to have a change on GDP and ultimately on the economy. Now, we spent a ton of time talking about monetary policy. The Federal Reserve Bank is the U.S. central bank. The Federal Reserve Bank has three different policy tools that it can use. The reserve requirement, so the Fed is effectively the bank's bank and therefore holds regulatory authority over many of the local banks. And they set the reserve requirement. That reserve requirement has been set at about 10% for the last, I don't know how many years. In other words, for every deposit that's made in a local bank, that bank has to retain about 10% of that deposit and can lend out the other 90%. Okay, the Federal Reserve might in the future, I doubt that this is true, but they might change that reserve requirement as a monetary policy tool to affect the factors on the right-hand side of this equation and ultimately the economy. More commonly, the Fed engages in interest rate policy. What this policy is the Fed will increase or decrease the money supply, which will increase or decrease interest rates. The interest rate that the Fed affects through this type of interest rate policy is called the Fed funds rate. Now, the Fed funds rate is the interest rate that banks pay other banks on overnight loans. We used the example in class last week that if Wells Fargo dipped below its reserve requirement, they might call up Zions Bank and ask for a loan, an overnight loan, to make sure that their reserves meet the required threshold. The interest rate that Wells Fargo would pay Zions on those overnight loans is the Fed funds rate. That's the interest rate that the Federal Reserve recently cut in an emergency situation last week as the coronavirus has spread and adversely affected the economy. Interest rates, the Fed met and cut interest rates quickly. Just yesterday, as a matter of fact, the Fed used its third monetary policy tool, quantitative easing. This was more common during the financial crisis and hasn't been used too frequently since then. But yesterday, the Fed injected $1 trillion into the economy. All right. I'm not exactly sure what they were doing. It looks like they bought up a bunch of bonds, putting money into the economy. This type of quantitative easing is almost an instantaneous way of the Federal Reserve affecting the money supply. And with more money out there in the economy, you can imagine that there might be greater consumption, greater investment. The purpose of quantitative easing was to try to spur consumption, spur investment in hopes that they could increase government spending. So, with an understanding of the different types of policy, governmental policy, with this model in the back of our mind, let's talk about how we would go about conducting qualitative analysis rather. We want to talk about what type of fiscal policy do we expect to happen in the future. For instance, President Trump has held a number of press conferences recently to discuss what the U.S. government is going to do about the coronavirus. Some of what the government might do is try to stimulate the economy by spending new money on research and development for that drug. That would have an effect, perhaps on eye here. The government has also talked about maybe eliminating the payroll tax or reducing the payroll tax. That's your Social Security, your FICA tax that comes out of your paycheck. They talked about reducing that effectively to zero for the rest of the year as a type of fiscal policy tool to try to combat the recent effect of the coronavirus on the economy. So this would be the type of qualitative analysis that you would write about in your one-page report in Project 2. Second, you'd also want to talk about what the Federal Reserve has done and what you continue to expect the Federal Reserve to do. There are pundits on CNBC, for instance, that continue to suggest that the Federal Reserve should cut rates to zero, so engage in, again, interest rate policy, and should increase the amount of quantitative easing, increase the money supply that exists in the economy. Now, your qualitative analysis, by answering these two questions, is going to give you the ability to provide some anecdotes about what you expect the economy to do in the future. This is the purpose of trying to solve Project 2's Part 1A, which is to provide some qualitative macroeconomic analysis about the economy for the foreseeable future.